apologies for any weirdness in my voice in this episode, ladies and gentlemen, everyone in between. I am still getting over some COVID. Not fun. Stories are told in many ways. As a single short snippet, as a grand epic saga, or, as is becoming increasingly common, through multiple media. Books, television, films, games, podcasts, you name it, and a major series has probably got a portion of its story on it. Stories that confine themselves to one medium were at one point becoming a rarity, though they are making a real comeback. Today, this has become known as transmedia storytelling. But nowhere has this multimedia expansion been more visible than in the world of video games, which is becoming one of the major narrative mediums. When and where did this approach start? Which did it better? Which did it worse? While no solid answer is guaranteed, this, ladies and gentlemen and everyone in between, is the subject of this episode of Author Talks. As defined by media scholar Henry Jenkins and reproduced by Mari-Laurie Ryan in her paper Transmedia Storytelling, Industry Buzzword or New Narrative Experience, transmedia storytelling represents a process where integral elements of a fiction get dispersed systematically across multiple delivery channels for the purpose of creating a unified and coordinated entertainment experience. Ideally, each medium makes its own unique contribution to the unfolding of the story. End quote. This is distinct from an adaptation, as it tells a new story within the same universe rather than adapting an existing narrative. But, as Ryan points out, is the term and notion of transmedia a legitimate storytelling platform, or simply a marketing buzzword? As again pointed out by Ryan, the phenomenon of transfictionality, the passage of fiction from one medium to another, is potentially as old as the Western novel. The phenomenon can cover fan fiction, or legitimate authorized extensions to a universe, but where it has become most obvious is in the realm of video games. Video games started out with little to no narrative, but as technology and ambitions grew, they became mediums to tell stories that were sometimes on a level with great literature or movies. See games like Vagrant Story, or BioWare's Baldur's Gate, or Funcom's Dreamfall series for evidence of that. But with the growth of games came the growth of media franchises around them, something that also has ancient roots. Think of the lithographic depictions and themed merchandise of Samuel Richardson's Pamela, or the industries that grew up around the works of Dickens and Conan Doyle. Kelly McCurleen raises several of these points in her book Interactive Narratives and Transmedia Storytelling. Indeed, transmedia storytelling has become so common in the modern day that entire fields of scholarship are starting to focus on it. But in this small podcast episode, I've chosen to highlight 4 examples in the video game space, a space I enjoy, that started at different times and have differing levels of comprehensibility and stability, and all have different fates. Starting with a genre-defining title.
The Covenant were right. This ring, it's Forerunner. Give me a second to access. Yes, the Forerunner built this place, what they called a fortress world, in order to... Wait. No, that can't be. Oh, those Covenant fools. They must have known. There must have been signs.
Slow down. You're losing me.
The Covenant found something. Buried in this ring. Something horrible. And now they're afraid.
Something buried? Where?
The captain. We've got to stop the captain.
Keys?
The weapons cache he's looking for. It's not really... We can't let him get inside.
I don't understand.
There's no time. Get out of here. Find keys. Stop him. Before it's too late!
Halo Combat Evolved was released in 2001 for the Xbox and changed the landscape of first-person shooters, but it also had an engaging science fiction narrative that was expanded through novels from the first game on. In this instance, Halo Fall of Reach, which sets up the game's events. Halo is an instance where the player can mostly follow events for the first 3 entries without too much trouble, though there are some elements that will come off as confusing without access to other media. Side character Johnson, for instance, is heavily implied to have died in the first game, but shows up in the second. The second game also soft retcons a survivor from the hostile alien Covenant faction, who becomes one of Halo 2's playable characters as the Arbiter. These events are chronicled in expanded media, but don't make the games totally confusing. There is also the fact that many of these expansions met with praise rather than frustration. It was with later titles, starting with Halo 4, that the storyline seemed to grow increasingly reliant on the transmedia approach, which reached a peak in Halo 5 where large chunks of the narrative were borderline incomprehensible without knowledge of the spin-off titles and expanded media. There is an implied reason behind this shift. The Halo series Bible, from which the lore is drawn, was built retroactively when development began on Halo Reach, with publisher Microsoft working together with external company Starlight Runner. As recounted in Tom Dowd's Storytelling Across Worlds, Starlight Runner's founder Jeff Gomez created the Bible to ensure future continuity and incorporated elements from both the series and its fan-created expansions. And of course this expansion was in part to create a profitable return for Microsoft on what had become a premier franchise. But it's telling that when Halo Infinite was being developed, it relied far less on multimedia expansions and told its story within itself as a standalone, with it being designed as almost a soft reboot for new and old players. So, this is an example where multimedia was used from the outset, but the series developers eventually dialed back as bloat threatened to destabilize. Now let's look at an example where the multimedia approach felt more like a crutch, and perhaps contributed to a state of, shall we say, undeath?
DNA doesn't just get up and go walk about to kill people.
It does if it's recombinant.
What now?
Recombinant, a DNA that mutates genes at the cellular level, like a cancer or a virus.
Soon we will all ascend.
But it only spreads to a specific target vector.
What? Speak English, for God's sakes!
Necrotic flesh, Bram. It infects dead bodies.
Altman be praised.
The Dead Space series is almost a textbook example of publisher ambitions destroying something. Begun as a bit of a passion project within EA Redwood Shores, later Visceral Games, Dead Space was subject to a strategy that was termed IP Cubed by Electronic Arts' then CEO, John Riccitiello. The aim was to create a universe with centuries of history the developers and collaborators could draw on. The core property was always the survival horror video game Dead Space, but its release was complemented by 3 other properties: a limited edition comic, an animated direct-to-video movie, and a browser game. Each detailed a different aspect of the events of Dead Space, from the discovery of the mysterious marker artifact on the planet Aegis 7 to the overrunning of the colony and mining ship Ishimura with reanimated corpses dubbed necromorphs. Long before hapless protagonist Isaac Clarke steps aboard the Ishimura, these additional pieces of media filled in events and introduced characters original and recurring. The comics writer, Anthony Johnston, noted that the properties were mostly kept separate and standalone, allowing them to be enjoyed in isolation, and I would argue they succeeded. Following the modest success of Dead Space, Electronic Arts and Visceral Games doubled down on this approach, with the expanded media of the series being redubbed as a transmedia franchise. The term transmedia isn't especially new, but Electronic Arts definitely wanted to make use of it. The second game was preceded narratively by 2 spin-off games, a novel, a second animated movie, and a graphic novel. And again, even though some plot points are better understood with the context of the other pieces of media, you could go through the plot of Dead Space 2 without needing to absorb the other bits and pieces. It was with Dead Space 3 that things got out of hand. By this point, the series was in difficulties due to low sales and the need for Visceral Games to aim for a wider market, which ultimately diluted its market appeal. It also meant that its media support was more sporadic, 1 novel and 1 graphic novel. The graphic novel, it is confirmed, was done in a bit of a hurry, and when you see the game, you find that some of the characters lack context for their actions, context that you get a better grasp of if you read the graphic novel. Dead Space is a sad study, as ultimately the approach only began to break down with the 3rd game when the series was already suffering from crippling problems. But it also showed a growing reliance on the transmedia approach when creating its broader narrative. It is possible that Dead Space 2 would have worked better without all those ancillary stories, if it had contained its plot and character growth within a single entry. Dead Space 3 had it worse still. The first Dead Space managed to strike a near impossible balance, but it proved to be an instance of lightning only striking once. Corporate greed and mismanagement had a role to play, but perhaps if the transmedia approach had been less daunting and spread out, it might have helped. And now we've covered 2 Western efforts, let's take a look at one from a Japanese company that's become somewhat notorious for their expanded media. Let's go to another world, an intraglobular world on the brink of ruin.
水から這い出た人間は環境を作り変えることで進化から逃れて生きてきました。みんな明るい未来を夢見てました。だけどそんなものは世界の秩序に捨てられてしまいました。これはかつて人間だった人たちの物語。これは人間であり続けた人たちの物語。
I've already covered this piece of media in a more rambling way in the first ever episode of Author Talks, but this is a chance to look at it in a potentially more engaging way. The Code Age project was created by Square Enix artist Yusuke Naora in 2002, who acted as its overall producer. Naora wanted to create a world where multiple stories could be told, each independent from the other but tying into a greater narrative and featuring callbacks through character cameos. The property was initially split into 3 parts: Code Age Commanders for the PS2, Code Age Brawls for mobile, and Code Age Archives as a manga. An anime was considered, but specifically avoided so people didn't assume the game project was the spin-off. While having mostly separate creative leads, Naora acted as overall supervisor. While it was born prior to it, the Code Age project became part of Square Enix's polymorphic content policy, which in the words of then President Yoichi Wada was to provide, quote, well-known properties on several platforms allowing exposure of the products to as wide an audience as possible, unquote. The initial wave of projects notably included Final Fantasy and Mana, but Code Age was an original creation, and while 3 projects were all the initial plan had, Naora stated that further Code Age projects would arise if they were a success. Unfortunately, they were not a success, but here I don't think it can be due to the structure of the story. As far as I can gather, given that the story maybe didn't have the best writing despite an intriguing premises, the game just hit the market at the wrong time. In Japan, it wasn't that popular, its release timing coinciding with the release of next-generation hardware and a number of other popular gaming titles. It appears that due to this lack of success, a planned localization of Commanders to the West was cancelled. Ironic, considering the game was designed with a Western audience in mind. Today, Commanders is the only entry that's in any way easily accessible, as the manga was never collected into paperback form and the mobile game shut down with hardly any footage extant. And even then, no fan translation of Commanders exists. In this episode, we have seen different examples of the transmedia phenomenon in video games, something I have engaged with to varying degrees. In Halo, we saw a strong start that grew into a bloated mess before being trimmed back. In Dead Space, we saw it sprawl out and dilute itself into a shell of its former self. And in Code Age, we saw a simple failure to launch. These are all risks, and there are others I could talk about in detail, such as Mass Effect and many modern Final Fantasy titles, but I think this is enough to perhaps get you thinking about how stories are told, can be told, and how we engage with them today. Furthermore, this episode was focused on games, but what else might follow this pattern? Have you thought about the endless fragmentation of the MCU, the expansions to the universes of Tolkien and George R.R. Martin? Transmedia is part of modern entertainment, and it's not a new art form. It's just that today, when it stumbles hard, and when it works extremely well. Perhaps in worlds that stretch beyond just one future and into endless possibilities. And they should be entering my recording area right about now.
Alert. Heavy damage. Standard complex legal system estimated. Initiate short range control. Activating short-range attack gear. Alert. Large enemy group detected.
Yes, I'm aware of that.
The Drakengard and Nier series began in 2003 as a single game with a dark, depressing and revisionist narrative that wasn't going to get a sequel, so it had multiple endings which defied convention by getting progressively worse as they were unlocked. Director Yoko Taro's approach to the series going forward appears to have been throwing different ancillary stories about whenever available and in any medium he wants. Okay, that's a slight exaggeration, but only a slight one. Now, I wanted to talk about this in more detail, but there is so much stuff one could dive into, almost too much. Every single entry in the series has at least one supplementary piece of media, whether it's an online comic, a novel, or, in the most extreme cases, CD dramas and concert recitals. So if you want to see more about the crazy and amazing worlds of Drakengard and Nier, just do some digging. There's a massive fan community that is preserving and translating and summarising this content to this day. And here's the kicker. None of it is essential for enjoying the games. At least that's where I could have ended, but there is something a little extra, an illicit detail that took a lot of digging to find. Now, I shouldn't be telling you this, but I found this interesting book. Took a lot of time to get it, so I...
Jeez, you're stubborn!
Oh no!
Alert! Requesting condition 2-8, under authority 777. Load the following code! Divergence, Branch B.
And here's the kicker. None of it is essential for enjoying the games. I could go on with this and expand well beyond the video game space that I've covered here in very light detail, but I think I shall wrap up with this quote from the scholar Melanie Schiller in her 2022 essay, Transmedia Storytelling, New Practices and Audiences. Her comment relates to one of the problems with transmedia that I think you might have noticed in the examples listed above. To respond to the growing influence of fans, the industry will have to produce an enhanced diversity of characters and story world interpretations, as is already happening to a limited extent. Further research also needs to address the dynamic interplay between marketing-driven transmedia storytelling on the one hand, and the homemade contributions of audiences on the other. Lastly, new narrative models and concepts for collective forms of authorship still need to be developed to address the convergence of the traditionally separate roles of author, industry, and consumers.